dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? It's utterly, utterly evil.
In a world with such pain and suffering, so much sadness and sorrow, one thing becomes clear. If God does exist, then he is most certainly an evil God. With all of the... Owen, can I help you?
Hey, Daddy. What are you doing?
Daddy's working now. Why don't you go play with Minecraft or something?
Why are you talking funny like that?
We've talked about this. This is Daddy's epic movie voice. How did your little sister get in here? Take her and let Daddy work. With all the disasters and horrors in the world, only an evil God would allow...
Daddy.
Listen, Owen,
Why are you saying God is evil?
That's Daddy's script. Now let
If
me...
God is evil, he is really bad at it.
Okay, that's nice,
If God is evil, then why do you make good things like puppies and happiness? And why do you make ice cream taste so good?
I don't want to get into a whole...
And why do you make you, me, and Mia, and Mommy, and Grandma?
Which grandma?
Nana.
My mother-in-law? Yeah, well, that's not helping your case.
Hey, that's not nice.
Get your little sister out of here. I'm gonna kill that dog. Take those words off the screen.
Mommy, Daddy says that God's evil and Grandma proves it.
Oh, jeez.
He says he's gonna kill the dog.
Oh, that's great. For the love of God, people, let me finish. Only an evil God would allow a world with so much tragedy and sad...
Daddy.
What?
You spelled tragedy wrong.
So welcome to RDOF, Rational Defense of Faith. Rational Defense of Faith. In our events, this is what we do. We show that rationality and reason go hand in hand with belief in God. And like the greatest scientists and thinkers in history, we see that science and philosophy, rather than counter the existence of God, completely supports it. Now, you might hear me say that and say, no, I've heard on YouTube that's not true. I heard it. I want to tell you that if that's you tonight, you're here and you're a skeptic, or you're an atheist, or somebody forced you to be here, I am glad you're here. This church, everyone welcomes you. And I just ask one thing tonight for you, that you consider what I say. Allow us to serve you. That is the heart of this ministry. We are not at war with atheists at all. So how many people were at the last event? Yeah? All right. I was blown away by the response we had at that event. I can't tell you how many stories I heard of people that came in the door that had questions that they did not feel they had answers for, and who told me they left there transformed. And we are honored to be a part of that. And if you haven't seen that video, it's the first one we posted, and it's completely free. There's a link on our website. Go check it out. Watch that. We also have DVDs to give away tonight. So they're all here. Make sure you check it out. Now, I can only cover so much in an event like this on a topic. And you heard about this. If you want to get a lot deeper, if you want to do some role playing, if you want to have mock conversations, consider the mentoring. All right, so we dig in deep to this topic and other topics, as Pastor Reggie talked about with my friend here, Bruce. and he's amazing, and I just can't recommend it enough. So if you want to dig in, RDOF Mentoring, check your mentoring box. Tonight is a continuation from our last event, where we took on the question, if God exists, why is there evil and suffering in the world? This is what atheists consider the greatest argument against the existence of God. In philosophy, this is aptly titled The Problem of Evil. Many people have probably heard of the problem of evil. How many have? The rest of you, we're going to introduce you to it. The idea of, or the question of why God allows suffering in philosophy is called the problem of evil. This is a very painful subject for many people. Why would God allow people to suffer? As I've said in other events, I have personal experience with this. Both my mother and father were diagnosed with cancer. Both of them went through a long process. My father with chemo, my mother with severe, debilitating chronic pain. So bad for her that she would ask us to let her die. And you can know that my sisters and I asked this question, why God? Such good people, the greatest people I've ever known. Why would you allow this? And this is a problem for many people. So many people struggle with this question. But in our last event, we showed that when we look at logic, which is what we're gonna do, we're gonna look at logic here. When we look at logic, even though the problem of evil is considered the greatest argument against the existence of God, unbeknownst to many people, this is actually not considered a good argument against God, even in professional philosophy and even by prominent atheist philosophers. In our last event, we saw the reasons why. We saw that not only is the evil and suffering in the world consistent with the existence of God, but it's consistent with his stated purpose for humanity. So put simply, in high-level philosophy, the problem of evil is widely considered to have been solved. But tonight we're going to see that prominent atheists and YouTube atheists seem to not be aware of this fact, and they still regularly use this argument against God. And tonight we're going to address this, and we're going to see what lengths they will go to maintain this argument. And we're going to also see how this actually reinforces our position as believers. Now, in our last event, we divided evil into two categories: moral evil and natural evil. All right, first, we're gonna talk about, in the first part tonight, we're gonna talk about moral evil. This is evil that are results of the acts of another human being, like rape or murder or torture. A question would be, if God exists, why would he allow children to be abused? Why would he allow 6 million Jews to be tortured and murdered? And so, as we enter into this, before we even start talking about evil, we have to step back and ask the broader questions. Why are we here? What is God's ultimate purpose for humanity? And what does his word say about that? And I'm gonna say something a few times tonight. Atheists typically will argue using God's word. Here's the rules for that. If you're going to be logical about this, if you're going to use God's word against him, you have to consider all of what he says, not just the part that supports your argument. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He said this. He said, love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. He also said to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Pretty clear. The biblical narrative is consumed with the idea of love. Love, as all of us know, is the greatest of all ethics. It is the greatest of all virtues. You don't have to be a believer to know this. Without love, we would not be human. This is key to understanding how to talk about evil. But we saw something in our last event. We saw that love is very particular. because love requires something very specific, a freedom. It requires the freedom to choose. Science backs this up. The Huffington Post says that real love is a choice. Love is all about choices. Psychology Today says that love in reality is a series of choices. Love is making a choice every day either to love or not to love. Kurt Smith, who is a doctor of psychology and a writer for Psychology Today, says that love is a choice more than a feeling. Who we love is as much as a choice as it is a feeling. So love, the greatest of all ethics, is predicated on us having the ability to choose, on having free choice. If you don't have free choice, you cannot have love. This is logically binding. Real love can only exist if those involved could have chosen otherwise. Could have chosen otherwise. You cannot force someone to love. You cannot love for them. Love without choice is like wind without air. It's logically impossible. So we can conclude that choice is a logically necessary requirement for love to exist. Going back to what God said as the greatest commandment. Since his desire for us, above all things, is for us to love him and to love one another, he had to give us the capacity to choose, a freedom of the will. Now, this not just points to a God, this points to a good God, a loving God. Because of his goodness and his love, he would not force us to choose him. He would not force us to love him any more than a good man would never force a woman to love him. So out of love, he gave us this freedom of the will to freely choose him. Well, as we saw, having this freedom not only gives us the choice to love, but to make other choices, morally good choices, but also morally evil choices. Enter evil. Because of this, it is then logically consistent for a good, loving God to exist along with moral evil. Folks, this is logically binding. You cannot escape it. But many people will react to that and say, nah, I don't get it. Because if your God is all-powerful, if your God is omnipotent, that means he can do anything. If that's true, then he could make a world where there is no evil, but where we are also free. Not so fast. You see, in these moments, we have to make a distinction. We have to make a distinction between an action that is logically possible and an action that is logically self-contradictory. It is possible for me to get up here and make a 10-foot by 10-foot square. But it is logically impossible for me to get up here and make a 10-foot by 10-foot square circle. Why? Because the notion of a square circle is logically self-contradictory. It's a meaningless string of words. It means nothing. It's logically impossible. It does not describe any possible action of any kind. Do you understand that? So, just as something cannot be a square and a circle simultaneously, someone cannot be married and be a bachelor simultaneously, although we've known people who've put that to the test. And just as something cannot be a square and a circle simultaneously, someone cannot be free and unfree simultaneously. So it's logically incoherent to ask God to give us freedom of choice while simultaneously keeping us from making choices, and that includes evil choices. If he did, we're not free. Check this out.
How is it that there is evil in the world if God exists? Either the Christian God is not all-powerful, or he is evil. Either way, he cannot be what he claims to be. Either God is the evil in the world, can't stop the evil in the world, or doesn't exist.
Many people claim that it is logically impossible for a good God to exist when there is so much evil in the world? The argument sounds something like this. If God is good, and He is truly omnipotent, then by definition, He is all-powerful. If He is all-powerful, then why does He allow evil? Why does He allow things like genocide, the Holocaust, the torturing of slaves, the raping and abuse of women and children, terrorism? The answer to this question lies in the fact that we are even free to ask the question itself. For God to be omnipotent and all-powerful does not mean that He can do something that is logically contradictory. For instance, it is logically contradictory to assume God could create a cube with 12 sides. A cube can only have 6 sides. This is clearly a logical contradiction. It is also logically contradictory to assume God could create an unmarried spouse, or to think He could create an honest liar. In the same way, it's logically contradictory to assume God could create creatures that are simultaneously free and unfree. So God cannot create 12-sided cubes, honest liars, unmarried spouses, or creatures that are simultaneously free and unfree, since these ideas are meaningless and self-contradictory. God gave His creatures the ultimate gift. He gave us the capacity to love. Love is the utmost good. God holds this as the highest ethic. To love Him with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. And also to love our neighbor as ourselves. But love is impossible without having freedom, the freedom of the will. He gave us the power to freely choose to love. Without such freedom, love couldn't exist. But with the freedom to love comes the freedom not to love, or even the freedom to hate. With this, we also have the freedom to choose good. But with the freedom to choose good comes the freedom to choose evil. This is logically inescapable. So, the very freedom of our will makes the existence of evil not only possible, but rationally unavoidable. And as it pertains to the existence of God, we see that unquestionably the existence of evil is logically consistent with the existence of a good God, a God who gave His creatures the ultimate gift and the freedom to choose. Asking God to forbid His creatures from doing evil is asking Him to force them to only do good. To force His creatures to only do good is to take away the freedom of their will. If there is no freedom of the will, there is no freedom to do evil, no freedom to do good, no freedom to hate, and no freedom to love. And without this freedom, we would not even be free to ask the very question of His existence.
So clearly we can see how the existence of moral evil is completely consistent with the existence of God. And it also aligns with His desire that we possessed the greatest human ethic of love. C.S. Lewis says it like this: free will, though it makes evil possible, is the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. So the existence of human free will makes it logically consistent for not just a God, but a good God to exist along with moral evil. This is logically ironclad, and in professional philosophy, it resolves the moral problem of evil, despite what you hear on YouTube. So how do leading atheists respond to this? What do? They are compelled to resort to something truly extraordinary. Something that essentially removes the very foundation of what makes us human. They claim that humans do not have free will. That's right, this is their solution to the problem of evil. That you and I are not free to choose anything, meaning you thought you chose to come here tonight. You did not. You thought you chose to buy that car. You did not choose to buy that car. You thought that you chose to get Japanese the other, Tuesday. You didn't. It was not your choice. I am not choosing to raise my hand right now. In fact, I'm not choosing to tell you that I'm not choosing to tell you this right now, and you are not choosing to decide whether you believe me or don't. This is their answer to the problem of evil. I kid you not. This is what's called determinism. Defined, determinism is a theory or doctrine that acts of the will, occurrences in nature, or social or psychological phenomena are causally determined by preceding events or natural laws. Simply, they are saying this means that your decisions are not your own, but rather the inevitable result of the laws of physics put in motion billions of years ago. That is your decisions, and you have no control over it. Does anybody know this word determinism? Well, I'm introducing it to you. You need to know this word, and you're gonna find out more as this event goes on. Not only is this an atheist's primary tactic to keep the problem of evil alive, to argue against the existence of God, this word, determinism, could very well change your way of life. Know this word. I want to make sure everybody understands what determinism is. Listen to these guys explain it.
So I'm a determinist. I basically believe that at any one point in time, it's completely the configuration of molecules in the universe, and in particular in your brain, that mandates what you do, and that you could not have done anything other than you did. In other words, you don't have any choices.
If you believed in determinism, you believe that every single thing that happens in this room, including my hand motion, was determined at the beginning of time.
We can't choose what we choose in life. And when it seems that we choose what we choose, so perhaps when going back and forth between two options, we don't choose to choose what we choose.
Do you understand? They said this, I didn't. This is determinism. You have no choice in any of your actions. Determinism is the opposite of free will. Now, since we have seen that the existence of free will in philosophy makes it logically possible for a good God to exist along with moral evil, their tactic here is to argue that free will does not exist. Do y'all understand that? Determinism is the way they do this. Check this out.
When I think I have free will, when I think that I'm exercising free choice, I'm deluding myself. My brain states are determined by physical events.
I think everything I know about the world tells me that there's no such thing as free will. I don't believe there's such a thing as free will in the sense of a spirit or soul. Our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain,
Religions like Christianity and Islam entirely depend on this notion of free will. It's not an accident. This is the only answer they have given to the problem of evil. God, in all his omnipotent goodness, couldn't intervene because people have free will.
One of the explanations that Christians apologists give for the fact that humans do morally horrible things to each other, despite the fact that God is benevolent and shouldn't happen, is that God gave us free will. So we have this sort of explanation for human evils based on free will absolutely predicates that we have a choice about whether to behave good or ill.
And free will is also what makes sense of this idea of sin.
You have a choice about whether to accept your Savior, if you're a Christian, whether or not Jesus Christ is your personal Lord and Savior. And if you make that choice, you go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell, no matter how good you've been. That, again, presupposes that you can make a choice.
So that's why this is, to my mind, the mother of all culture wars.
They have to get rid of free will to put God back on the hook for allowing moral evil. So I want everyone in here to be equipped to respond to this. Because if you go out and you have conversations, this is what you will hear. This, determinism. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at determinism. We're going to see how not only is it logically self-defeating, but it actually negates the claims of the very people that propose it. Consider the statement, I choose to believe in determinism. If I restate that, I'm saying, I choose to believe that I cannot choose to believe. Okay? At the onset, clearly, determinism seems to undermine itself, does it not? Now, I know what you husbands are thinking. I can read your mind. You're like, wait a minute. Did you say that no matter what I do, I'm not responsible for my choices? I mean, don't be bashing this determinism quite yet. I mean, this is like the best thing ever for marriage, right? I mean, so are you saying no matter what I do, I can tell my wife it wasn't my choice, it's not my fault? Before you get carried away, let's look at some evidence. So what is the evidence to back up this outlandish claim? There's not much. Many point to a few select experiments from people like Benjamin Libet that are said to demonstrate that there is no free will, suggesting that people in these experiments would wink and raise their arms before they consciously chose to do it. But many experts say these experiments do not demonstrate that there is no free will. This is discussed in Psychology Today, where experts say it does not disprove free will. In references to these experiments, an article in Psychology Today was subtitled, How Did a Flawed Experiment Become So Influential? For other reasons, this reason and many other reasons, many experts disagree with the claim that there is no free will. So much that the New York Times even had an article written about it called, Do You Have Free Will? Yes, it's the only choice. In it, it says, these supposed experts are deluding themselves that they think the question has been resolved. Free will hasn't been disproved scientifically or philosophically. The more that researchers investigate free will, the more good reasons there are to believe in it. Raymond Tallis is a neuroscientist from a little place called Oxford. He has an article in the New Atlantis that's called, How Can I Possibly Be Free? And the subtitle, Why the Neuroscientific Case Against Free Will is Wrong. Joe Horgan's a writer for Scientific American. He says science has discovered nothing that contradicts free will. Even Big Think has an article called Free Will Isn't an Illusion Either. An even Scientific American who reviewed Sam Harris's book on this topic says this: Harris seems to be advancing a reductio ad absurdum, except that he wants us to accept the absurdum. And the list, folks, goes on and on. Even fellow atheists disagree with the claim that free will does not exist. Now, I've said this before in other events. Bruce will attest to this. Evidence in and of itself doesn't say anything. It's all about the interpretation of evidence. Here's the problem with determinism. If determinism is true, that means that your reasoning, your interpretations of evidence, and your conclusions are all predetermined. You can't make any claim other than the claims that you make. You can't evaluate any claim other than the way that you evaluate it. You can't interpret evidence in any other way than the way that you interpret that evidence. You can't make any conclusion than the conclusion that you make. So on determinism, there's no way to know whether your predetermined knowing is the right knowing, because all knowing is just predetermined. And round we go. And guess what? The problem only gets worse when your claims are contradicted by others, whose reasoning and interpretations of evidence and conclusions are all predetermined. Right? All right, check this out.
In some sense, we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history.
If you dispense with the idea of free will, how is it you organize your relationship to yourself, your interactions with your family, and your relationships with the broader social community? I believe strongly that we have free will, that we're responsible for our choices.
There's a lot of arguments that we don't have freedom of the will. And the literature is kind of interesting, actually for reasons that William James discussed. He said, if you believe that there's no freedom of the will, why bother presenting an argument? You're forced to do it. The person you're talking to can't be convinced because there's no such thing as reasons. So why not watch a baseball game? That wasn't his example. But anybody who denies freedom of the will actually believes that it's there. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother presenting reasons. Unless they say, look, I'm just forced to present I can't do anything else but present these reasons. And it's very, very odd, these discussions, many of them. Actually, you may have seen some experimental work which caused a big flurry a couple of years ago. Some neurophysiologists discovered that if a person's going to carry an act of willed action, let's say, pick this up, say, you can find activity in the motor centers of the brain before there's a decision to pick it up, okay? And that was held to show, okay, we've undermined freedom of the will. It doesn't say anything. All it says is what we ought to know anyway. Decisions are mostly made unconsciously. By the time they reach the level of consciousness, they've probably already been made. But that doesn't tell anything about how decisions are made.
Probably the most vocally aggressive atheist who claims that free will is an illusion is Sam Harris. But, as you've seen, experts clearly disagree with this claim. And when it comes to other critics, well, they have not been quite as kind. And if determinism is true, and we cannot think and choose freely, these atheists have another problem. They'd have to lose one of their main slogans. Atheists commonly refer to themselves as free thinkers. But when you think about it logically, it leads to a contradiction. That is, if determinism is true and there is no free will, there could be no such thing as free thinking. Because if determinism is true, you're not thinking freely. And as a result, atheists apparently need a new slogan.
So, thank you. So you would ask, why am I spending time talking about this and showing those? His books, Sam Harris's books, are bestsellers. He has the ear of millions of people. And he's using this determinism and the idea of no free will to convince millions of people to his views. That's why I'm spending time on this. The other reason I'm spending time on this is that we have to remember that the problem of evil is considered the greatest argument against the existence of God. This argument fails if free will exists. So, the only hope to save this failed argument is if free will is gone. So it's important for us to all be equipped to respond to this. But guess what? They don't stop there. They don't just say that free will is an illusion, but that the self is an illusion. Look at this.
The self is an illusion, the sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts in addition to the thoughts. There's no place in the brain for your ego to be hiding.
You heard it. The self is an illusion. The self does not exist. There is no I. There is no I. There is no ego. There is no thinker of thoughts, which is just confusing to me. I must be missing something, because if there is no thinker of thoughts, then who had the thought that just came out of his mouth? They're saying that when you refer to yourself as I, that I is an illusion. But what happens when you ask them who said that? I mean, they can't say, I said that. So it's all very confusing. I don't really get it. Of all the arguments that they could make to save this argument, this is the one they choose. Sometimes we see the strength in our position when we see what is required to defend against it. Imagine a murder case. There's a court case and it's about a murder and they've got all kinds of evidence on this suspect for murder. And of all the defenses that this suspect can come up with, he comes into the courtroom and claims the entire judicial system is an illusion. That's my defense. Okay? Right off the bat, that would seem to strengthen the case of the prosecution, would it not? Also, he would have to present some serious evidence for this kind of claim. But here's the deal. This is what it also does. It also undermines his own validity in that judicial system. That's exactly what these atheists are doing when they're arguing against, in this case, against God. What do experts say on the matter? Stephen Taylor has a PhD of psychology from John Moores University. He says they always feature a self trying to prove it doesn't exist. They're caught in a loop. If the self is an illusion to begin with, how can we trust its judgments? It's a bit like a ghost trying to prove that ghosts don't exist. Any claim, including the claim that there is no self, presumes that there is some kind of reliable, objective observer inside of them who's able to pass judgments on matters. This presumption contradicts this entire argument. Put simply, they are sawing off the branch that they're standing on. Dave Chalmers is considered the world's leading philosopher of consciousness. He says clearly the self is not an illusion. Big Think echoes this, as does psychology today. And the list goes on and on. My father used to say that when your position is logically incoherent, the more you speak, the more contradictions will be revealed. This is true not just with atheists, but with Christians. And we see it in politics all the time. So let's listen to the very atheists who are making these claims. Listen to what they say.
Leading atheists Sam Harris and Jerry Coyne assert that free will is an illusion. As a result, they claim that no one has any choice about any action they do.
At any one point in time, you could not have done anything other than you did. In other words, you don't have any choices.
We experience ourselves as free agents, as the true authors of our thoughts and actions. But you can't square it with the world of causes, because however you talk about determinism or randomness or some combination thereof, that doesn't seem to give you any basis for freedom.
Harris makes his position very clear.
You no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say. We can't choose what we choose in life. We don't choose to choose what we choose.
And yet, when we hear him speaking about other topics in different settings, certain inconsistencies start to emerge. Even though he claims that we humans don't have free will and thus don't have the capacity to make our own choices, he turns around and completely contradicts this statement when he vehemently proclaims, "We have a choice. We have two options as human beings. We have a choice between conversation and war." Clearly, this statement undermines his claim that humans lack the capacity to make our own choices when he's telling us we have a choice.
You no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say.
But the inconsistencies get worse. Remember his statement.
We can't choose what we choose in life. We don't choose to choose what we choose.
And yet there seems to be a blatant contradiction to his statements on abortion.
There's no way to escape the sense of these landmarks being arbitrary, but I'm certainly pro-choice. The ethical ballast is all on the side of the freedom for a woman to choose what to do with her body. The freedom for a woman to choose.
And yet he told us earlier that we don't have that freedom.
Well, however you talk about determinism or randomness, that doesn't seem to give you any basis for freedom.
In addition to claiming that humans don't have the capacity to make their own choices, Harris also claims that the very idea of the self is an illusion.
What I am saying, however, is that the self is an illusion, the sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts in addition to the thoughts.
He claims that not only is the self an illusion, but also the ego and the I. And yet he regularly refers to himself as, well, himself.
That's what I find myself most worried about. A non-physicist like myself will defer to the authority of that consensus, and to change your behavior by yourself isn't sufficient to change the system. There was no ideology within communism that made immediate death for oneself and one's children look like a good thing.
It all culminates in a single statement where he literally contradicts all of these claims.
Everything I know about how people should behave around each other so as to maximize their well-being, I would find myself with no choice to behave in precisely that way. And it's the only rational choice for any person being sent to a maximum security prison is to become immediately affiliated with the gang of his, appropriate skin color. We can't choose what we choose in life. We don't choose to choose what we choose.
We're not here because we're free. We're here because we're not free.
And when we combine all of these statements together, it quite clearly appears to be a confusing collection of contradictions.
At any one point in time, you could not have done anything other than you did. In other words, you don't have any choices.
We can't choose what we choose in life. We don't choose to choose what we choose.
Choice
Remember, he says,
the ethical ballast is all on the side of the freedom for a woman to choose what to do with her body. The freedom for a woman to choose. The freedom for a woman to choose.
This leads to the question, how do you make a choice if you have no choice? Remember, he says,
we don't choose to choose what we choose.
But then he says,
I'm certainly pro-choice. I'm certainly pro-choice.
We don't choose to choose what we choose.
I'm certainly pro-choice. Pro-choice.
That doesn't make sense.
Remember, he says,
you no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say.
But then he says,
we have government that can decide. I decided the topic memory will be superhuman unless we decide to consciously degrade it.
You no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say.
I decided the topic. We have government that can decide.
I don't get it.
Then there's the self.
The self is an illusion. The self is an illusion. The sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts.
But then he says,
a non-physicist like myself, that's what I find myself most worried about. To change your behavior by yourself, death for oneself and one's children,
Allow myself to introduce myself.
The self is an illusion. The self is an illusion.
I am so sorry for your loss of yourself.
Captain, a most curious development on scanner 5-7.
Let's all take a look at it, Mr. Spock.
Screen on, Captain.
At any one point in time, you could not have done anything other than you did. In other words, you don't have any choices.
Fascinating.
We can't choose what we choose in life. We don't choose to choose what we choose.
There it is.
The ethical ballast is the freedom for a woman to choose what to do with her body. The freedom for a woman to choose. The freedom for a woman to choose.
Could be some form of space madness we've never heard of.
We don't choose to choose what we choose.
I'm certainly pro-choice. Pro-choice. The self is an illusion. The self is an illusion. A non-physicist like myself, that's what I find myself most worried about. To change your behavior by yourself, the self is an illusion. The self is an illusion.
Most illogical reaction.
Gotta have a sense of humor about these things, right? So clearly we see the weakness of these claims. We also see the lack of evidence. So why are they saying, on what basis are they saying that things like free will and the self don't exist? They say that free will and the self and the ego, you heard what he said, they can't be located in the brain, so they are an illusion. So what they've done here is they've set up a standard, all right? If it can't be measured in the brain, then it's an illusion. If you can't touch it, it doesn't exist. But here's the problem. If free will and the self and the ego are all assumed to be illusions based on this, then the same holds true for any non-physical thing that cannot be located in the brain. Football doesn't exist in some location in the brain. Does football exist? How about some atheist favorites? Women's rights, gay rights, moral obligation. These things are not physical. They cannot be touched. They're not hiding in some part of the brain any more than free will or the self. Do they exist? Do women's rights exist? Yes. Ironically, and this blows my mind, Sam Harris spends much of the time in his new book, Waking Up, defending, of all things, the idea that spirituality is a real thing, just not the God version of spirituality. He defends the idea that spirituality is a real thing, kind of a mock Buddhist kind of thing, I guess. when spirit, according to the dictionary, is defined as a non-physical, non-material part of a person. The Huffington Post addresses this in an article called "Don't Be Fooled by the Myth of Rational Materialism." It says, to some ideologies, spirituality is taboo, and Harris had violated the cardinal tenet of materialism. If you can't touch it, it doesn't exist, which pretty much throws modern physics out the window. So it seems here that while trying to throw out God, these atheists end up throwing out all of their own beliefs, all of their own causes, and the entire field of physics out with it, which makes the very things that they are crusading about, by their definition, illusions. So let's look at the implications of this if we were to accept it. I told you that this word determinism will affect your lives. And it already is. You may not know it. What are the implications here? If you remove God and you accept this purely deterministic world that these atheists are claiming, what are the ramifications of such a world? Famous philosopher Immanuel Kant says it like this: if we are not free to choose, then it would make no sense to say we ought to choose the path of righteousness. The U.S. Supreme Court says this, says free will is a universal and persistent foundation stone in our system of law, and that determinism was inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system. In our criminal justice system, a criminal's culpability, that is, his level of guilt, is based on his intention and his choices. In a deterministic world, how can any of us be logically held responsible for what we do? The fact that there is no justice if free will does not exist is expressed in many publications. But determinism has already made it into our courtrooms. And data shows that the number of cases using it, where defendants claim that their brain made them do it, has more than doubled in just the past decade. It also shows that studies specifically on people who do not believe in free will show that they stop seeing themselves as blameworthy for their actions, and they give in to their baser instincts. The Atlantic clearly points this out. It says, in every regard, it seems when we embrace determinism, we indulge our dark side. A study at the University of Pittsburgh found that people who believe less in free will are more likely to behave immorally. And sadly, it turns out that determinism is already being used to defend the worst kind of predators. In the New American, there's an article called "Is Pedophilia Okay If You're Born That Way?" where they are using determinism to defend pedophiliacs. And it says this in the article: to abide by the principle of biological determinism, the force governing animals, would beget an animalistic society. Remember that acceptance of biological determinism implies that there is nothing better, namely morality, to govern our behavior. So what does a deterministic world look like? Check this out.
So I'm a determinist. I basically believe that at any one point in time, it's completely the configuration of molecules in the universe, and in particular in your brain, that mandates what you do, and that you could not have done anything other than you did. In other words, you don't have any choices. You don't have any choices. You don't have any
This is determinism, where we are nothing more than robots made out of meat.
You don't believe that you're robots made out of meat, which is what I'm going to try to convince you of today.
And as you follow the logic of determinism, it leads to the belief that there is no free will.
I'm so glad you're here, and you are a non-believer.
Yes. The popular conception of free will seems to rest on two assumptions. Okay, the first is that each of us was free to think and act differently than we did in the past. The second assumption is that you are the conscious source of your thoughts and actions. Now, unfortunately, we know that both of these assumptions are false. I hope to convince you that free will is an illusion.
And if there is no free will, then this inevitably leads to the cold truth that no one, even murderers, are responsible for their actions.
Consider you're a generic murderer. Okay, his choice to commit his last murder was preceded by a certain pattern of electrochemical activity in his brain. The moment we catch sight of this stream of causes, the sense of his culpability disappears, that the place where we would place our blame disappears.
No criminal has a choice about what they do when they do the crime. It is the result of their genes and their environment. No criminal has a choice about what they do.
So ask yourself this question. Do you really have no free will? Are you just a robot made out of meat?
That's determinism. I told you, it will affect your life. So these atheists are saying here that you cannot blame a criminal because he had no choice. The irony here is that these guys are withholding blame from criminals, saying they had no choice, yet they make careers out of attacking Christians for what they believe, when according to them, we have no choice but to believe it. Apparently, murderers and psychopaths get a free pass, but us Christians don't, right? I get it. So how do they suggest that we proceed in society? How do they suggest we proceed? They say this, that we should just believe in the illusion of free will, the illusion of free will. We just kind of kid ourselves like we have free will. They said we should just choose to live as if we have it. We should choose to live as if we have it. Anybody see a problem here? You're figuring this out. We've seen some contradictions tonight, but this one might take the prize. On one side, they say we do not have the capacity to choose, but now they're telling us that we should freely choose to believe in the illusion of free will. What's more ironic is that these militant atheists accuse you, Christians, for believing an illusion. And now they're telling you to believe an illusion. So apparently we can believe in illusions, but just the illusions they say we can believe in. So now let's talk about love. The greatest ethic, love. Remember, love can only exist if we are free to choose. But according to them, we are not free to choose. So how exactly do atheists then define love on this perception? Check it out.
Our neurons are lousy processors, so we need big fat brains to make clever us, and consequently, that's what creates love. That's what creates our cross-cultural human mating system. It comes from the fact that neurons are lousy processors.
We take sexual jealousy, for instance. And this is an attitude that has been bred into us over millions of years. Okay, our ancestors were highly covetous of one another. And this possessiveness now gets enshrined in various cultural institutions like the institution of marriage. Okay, so therefore, a statement like it's wrong to cheat on one's spouse, it seems like it's an improvisation on the back of biology. It seems that from the point of view of science, it can't really be wrong to cheat on your spouse. Okay, this is just how apes like ourselves worry when we learn to worry with words.
Monogamy is ridiculous, and people aren't any good at it. We're not wired for it. We didn't evolve to be. It's unnatural. And the truth of the matter is that if you're with somebody for 40, 50 years and they only cheated on you a few times, they were good at being monogamous. Not bad at being monogamous, they were good at it. So I do think there needs to be some leeway.
Why is incest wrong? It's not clear to me that it's wrong. If a brother and a sister loved each other and used... Is there something absolutely morally wrong about that? Because I don't think there's any absolute condemnation of that fact. If they love each other and care for each other...
We get real here. Now, one thing I want you to know for sure, I am not saying that every atheist believes this. But what I am saying, that these are highly intelligent people, and they are playing out the logical implications of their worldview. They are being consistent with their worldview. Do you understand that? Are you? If that's you tonight, are you being consistent? This logically follows from their worldview. So ladies, apparently your man did not choose you above all others. In fact, he was just determined by the molecules in his body and his lousy neurons and his evolutionary apish urges to not choose you, I guess you could say. In fact, he no more chose you than he chose to get the flu. According to these guys, this is love in this deterministic world. Pretty romantic, huh? So I wonder what love messages and cards would look like in a deterministic world.
RDOF presents Deterministic Love Messages. Baby, my love for you is the byproduct of lousy neurons and apish urges from a mindless evolutionary process. But that's okay. We're a lot less hairy now. Baby, I no more chose to be with you than you chose to have IBS after last year's Christmas party. Girl, even though I'm probably biologically determined to leave you to find a more anatomically suitable mate, don't take it personally. It won't be my choice. This has been Deterministic Love Messages from RDOF.
Thank you. Oh, we have fun here, don't we? So, what does this mean? This means in order to save the problem of evil, atheists here have to throw out the greatest of all virtues, love. That's a big sacrifice. Remember that love requires choice. From the beginning, we learned that. Love requires choice. This is logically unavoidable. And this leads to a very stark fact. If determinism is true, because determinism says there is no choice, that means if determinism is true, love does not exist. Now, clearly that counters what we learned at the beginning about what God says, his greatest commandment, that we love. Complete opposites. In determinism, love does not exist. So, how does Sam Harris respond to this when it comes to his own wife? Check it out.
That facet is a bit depressing to me, that no one actually loves me if I don't make the choice. So, are you a bit unhappy with the idea that don't want to get a bit personal, but your wife didn't make the decision to love you, she just does. do you find that a bit depressing? Or, yeah, how do you deal with that?
Well, it's not that. I think the stripping off the illusion doesn't just change all the bad stuff, leaving all the good stuff exactly as it was. I think there's a cost to, you lose certain kinds of pleasures, or they become, you can't take them as seriously.
At least he's consistent. He's being logically consistent with his worldview. That's where it leads. So we've seen that these atheists need free will gone in order to advance their argument. But unfortunately, as we've seen tonight, scientific evidence and logic do not allow them that luxury. So what do? You've seen they exaggerate evidence, they proclaim unfounded facts, and they defy logical thought. Folks, there's nothing profound about that. There's nothing scientific about that. There's nothing compelling about that. There's nothing believable about that. And folks, this is their only play to save an argument that has already been dismissed in professional philosophy, even by prominent atheist philosophers. This is their only play. That's why I spent time on it. Remember, this is considered the greatest argument against the existence of God. You see where it lies. I'll let you decide what that means for yourself. So though we've seen some contradictions tonight, as I've said, these atheists were at least logically consistent with the implications of their worldview. They're not stupid. These guys are very intelligent. Everything they've said is logically consistent with atheism, with materialism. They know this. Do you? Do you know this? Intellectual atheists understand these implications. That is, if you accept an honest, intelligent, accurate view of atheism and not the pop culture YouTube version of atheism. Because they know that to accept the logical version of atheism is to remove what we have all just assumed to be self-evident truths about life, about love, about choice, about self-agency, about moral responsibility, about human worth, and about our very judicial system. The very things that make up our lives and what make us human. But here's the deal. Most atheists that I know and talk to, they accept these truths as being self-evident. And these people are good people. They value these truths, even to the point of being activist and emotional about it. But here is the deal. On their worldview, none of these self-evident truths are real. They're not real on their worldview of atheism. And yet we all here tonight, we live in a society predicated on these truths being self-evident. The very Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Endowed by their Creator. There is a reason it did not say endowed by determinism. There's a reason it didn't say endowed by evolution. And it talks about liberty. Liberty is defined as the quality or state of being free. It's also defined as the power of choice. Do you see what this means? But on their worldview, none of these self-evident truths are real. In our last event, we saw that intellectual atheists admit that these truths, along with democracy, morality, and human rights and equality, find their roots in Christianity. Atheist Friedrich Nietzsche says, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessarily remains in one's hands. Atheist Marquis de Sade says, no God, no moral imperatives, no thou shalt not, only I will. If you say that you value reason and critical thinking above all things tonight, if you're here and you're a skeptic and you're like, I didn't want to be at this place, I got pulled to come in here, I just want to ask you this. If you say you value reason and critical thinking above all things, do you own this, what I'm telling you about this worldview? Do you own it? These guys do. The intellectuals you've seen tonight that you're like, I can't believe that, they own it. Do you? If you really value reason and critical thinking, let the logical chips fall where they may. Be consistent with the implications of your worldview. But as I've said, most atheists are not. They're not. Unfortunately, for them, it turns out that they live in the same fantasy world that they accuse Christians of living in. So now we have talked about moral evil, and we see now more than ever that using moral evil against the existence of God fails as an argument. But that leaves us with natural evil, the toughest question, in my opinion. Natural evil. This is evil and suffering that are a result of purely natural events, like tsunamis, child leukemia, hurricanes, and earthquakes. Common thing you might hear, like I've heard, is if your God exists, why would he allow 1,000 people to die in an earthquake? And this is a hard question. It's a hard question, except it only really makes sense from a theistic point of view. And I'll tell you why. Even though this is a common atheistic argument, it only makes sense from a theistic point of view. Because here, essentially what's being done is the person arguing this is using human death as evidence against God. This assumes something. This assumes that humans have some higher value than other organisms. Otherwise, the atheist would be equally concerned with the snakes and the bugs and all the roaches that died in the earthquake. But they're talking about humans. Interesting, they just, out of the woodwork, they pull up humans as being important in this situation. This is called human exceptionalism. And there's no basis for it on atheism. Because the problem is, on atheism, there is no basis for the assumption that humans hold some value over other organisms. Atheist Stephen Hawking says this: the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderately sized planet. Atheist William Provine says, modern science directly implies that there is no ultimate meaning for humans. So making this argument based on the idea that humans have some special value is incoherent from the point of view of atheism. In order to make this argument against God, they have to freeload this idea of human value from somewhere else, from another worldview, i.e. Christianity. So this argument, for this reason, is widely accepted as being absurd from an atheistic perspective, but it's still there. As Christians, we still have this question. I faced it, Pastor Reggie's faced it. But as Christians, there are other properly basic beliefs that come with belief in God. And as a Christian, for that reason, we approach this from a different perspective. And so what we do here is we step back and we look at God's big picture. We look at his ultimate stated purpose for humanity. What is his ultimate purpose for why we're here? He makes this very clear. His purpose for us here was never physical, earthly happiness. It was never that. A lot of people in America do not like to hear that. I will say it again. His purpose for us, for you, was never physical, earthly happiness. It was something far greater. Something far greater. It is eternal happiness. There is only one way to attain that kind of happiness. It is through a relationship with him. God is not earthly minded like we try to paint him to be. He's never been earthly minded. He is kingdom minded. He is eternally minded. So that means, from what we've seen by his own words tonight, that God's ultimate purpose is for us to freely come into a relationship with him so that he could give us eternal happiness. That's the point. And what does this mean in regards to suffering? It means that everything that happens in our lives on this earth is to fulfill this eternal purpose. And that means that God may very well allow earthly human suffering to draw people in to this purpose, which is a relationship with him to yield ultimate happiness. And being an omniscient God, we could never understand how he could orchestrate these kinds of events to fulfill this purpose. Check this out.
We've seen that the existence of moral evil is completely consistent with the existence of God. But what about natural evil? The kind that's not a result of moral choices, things like the suffering of innocent children, natural disasters, seemingly unnecessary pain, loss, sadness, terminal diseases, and death. This is perhaps the biggest obstacle for belief in God. Why would he allow such things if he is truly good? Though we may not understand this, we must consider God's ultimate purpose for humanity. We need to understand the way true, ultimate happiness is accomplished. God's ultimate purpose for us is not that we attain earthly happiness. It is something far greater, something that gives us eternal happiness. His ultimate purpose is that his children may freely come to know him, to love him, and to enter into his kingdom. This brings ultimate happiness and eternal joy. Knowing this, as we face suffering and loss, though it seems hopeless, it's logical to believe that beyond this present pain, there is a much greater purpose at work. That every instance of earthly suffering we endure is to fulfill this purpose. For every instance of suffering, there is a greater compensating good that flows from it. Like a divinely orchestrated symphony of events, set in motion from every instance of suffering, silently unfolding, all leading towards an ultimate purpose. A purpose that far outweighs and far exceeds any momentary affliction we may experience. Yet we, being confined to the limits of space, time, and human intellect, could never comprehend the exceedingly complex labyrinth of events unfolding before us. An unseen world operating at the grandest of scales. A world we could never hope to understand. within the capacities of our earthly minds, a hidden lacework of paths, set in motion from each tragedy, all leading God's creatures into a relationship with Him. This gives rise to an eternal happiness that far outweighs and far overcompensates for any brief earthly suffering we may endure.
So there's no reason to believe that God could not have good, eternal, binding reasons for allowing earthly suffering to meet His purpose. And as anyone with a testimony will tell you, pain is about knowing God. It's the only way that many people ever get to meet Him. And this is even backed up by research that shows the countries with the most natural atrocities are the ones where Christianity is actually growing. In his Atheist Manifesto, Sam Harris is quick to talk about the destruction of Hurricane Katrina, but he didn't mention a poll done by the Washington Post that found that 80% of Katrina's survivors claim that the event only strengthened their faith in God. There's no reason to believe that a world with no earthly suffering would be a maximally good world. Because suffering does something. Suffering awakens us. It's like a lightning bolt. It awakens us to the reality, to the way things could have been. It enables us to know and appreciate joy. We all in here tonight know that a fish is wet. But guess what? A fish does not know that he is wet until you remove him from the water. Then, at that point, he experiences dryness and he appreciates wetness. A world where dryness does not exist is a world where wetness does not exist. Without the experience of being dry, that fish would never know what it is to be wet. And it's the same with us. Without the experience of suffering, we would never know what it is to be thankful, to know joy. In removing all of the suffering in the world as atheists demand of God, you would also remove the capacity to know happiness. And science backs this up. Psychology Today has an article called The Art of Happiness. It says research shows that happiness is not the result of bouncing from one joy to the next. Achieving happiness typically involves times of considerable discomfort. And then there is what we don't know. You see, for all the suffering we see with our limited senses, we have no way of knowing the myriads of tragedies that we ourselves have been spared. We have no way of knowing the trillions of lives that have been saved and the unseen miracles, all unbeknownst to us. We have no way to know because we do not have all knowledge. We look through the glass dimly. So we're in no position within the limits of our perception to make any claim like that about God, especially from an atheistic perspective. If you consider the bad in the world to make your argument against God, logically, you also have to consider all the good. Perhaps this is the most profound part. The whole question of why God allows suffering operates on the assumption that life is limited to only earthly physical existence. Yet a core foundational belief of Christianity is that we are eternal spiritual beings. If we use what God says to make our arguments, then we must accept all of what He says. And He says this. He says that we are eternal spiritual beings. That is what we are. That is what you are. When atheists curse God for allowing children to die of leukemia. This is only based on the idea that that child is a finite material creature. That's all that child is. And this is importing the unfounded doctrine of materialism. But that child is not. That child is an eternal being. That child is a spiritual being. That child will be in the arms of its creator. And from this perspective, any brief earthly suffering that we experience is only a tiny, minuscule of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of our existence, of that child's existence. And from that standpoint, ladies and gentlemen, any earthly suffering is insignificant compared to the eternal joy that awaits. And so when we look at earthly suffering from this perspective, it changes everything. It changes our perspective. So tonight we have seen why these philosophers say that the problem of evil is a bankrupt argument. Because the evil and suffering in the world is not only consistent with the existence of a God, it is consistent with the existence of a good God, of a loving God. It's also completely consistent with who he says he is and how he says our earthly existence will be. With this, we have every reason to have faith, even in the face of suffering that we may be going through, even in the face of hopelessness. And the most amazing thing about this is that God is not just out there somewhere watching on, standing by idly. He came to us. He came to endure it with us through his Son. This is amazing. He could have just sent Jesus to come and die a quick, painless death, and that would have met his sacrificial requirement. But he did something remarkable. He joined us in our suffering through Jesus, and Jesus endured relentless, brutal beatings. He endured one of the cruelest, torturous deaths known to man, almost to the point of breaking. And it is the death and suffering that he endured that gives power and meaning to our suffering. A perfect, that's right. A perfect heavenly being became acquainted with our suffering, with your suffering here tonight. And he loves us too much to force us to choose him. He loves us too much to force us to love him. But he gave us this choice so that we could experience love and we could experience eternal happiness with him. And God also uses suffering, human suffering, for what's called the building of souls, to instill in us virtues like love, self-sacrifice, kindness, and heroism. Virtues we may never attain in any other way than having the existence of suffering. Suffering is our future testimony being forged. It is your future testimony at work. It is your earthly purpose revealed. And suffering is a road that leads us to God, that leads us to freely choose a relationship with him, which yields ultimate happiness. So of all possible worlds, God could have created only this world that we live in enables us to have all of it. Love, kindness, self-sacrifice, heroism, and eternal happiness. Tonight, I want to tell you, however you walked in here, whatever your worldview, I want to tell you that you are an eternal spiritual being, even if you don't know that. And sometimes we have to hear what is required to argue against something to understand what we really believe. So I'm going to ask you tonight, wherever you're coming from, ask yourself to your heart of hearts, why do you believe what you believe walking in this door? I want to tell you guys, it has been my pleasure to be with you guys, and I want to leave you with this one last video.
We've seen God's ultimate purpose for us is not that we attain earthly happiness. His ultimate purpose is that His children may freely come to know Him and to enter into His kingdom. This brings ultimate happiness and eternal joy. Knowing this, it's logical to believe that beyond this present pain, there is a much greater purpose at work, that every instance of earthly suffering we endure is to fulfill this purpose. This gives rise to an eternal happiness that far outweighs and far overcompensates for any brief earthly suffering we may endure. We also must consider that our existence extends far beyond our earthly bodies. We are eternal beings, destined to be made new again with heavenly bodies, free of all pain and suffering forever. With this understanding, the weight of earthly suffering becomes utterly meaningless. Our present momentary afflictions will be long forgotten in the light of the eternal joy we will experience in the presence of our Creator. We have the hope of knowing that these brief earthly afflictions are only a minuscule part in a far exceedingly greater plan at work. Knowing all of this, it's also logical to believe that God can use this suffering for the building of souls, to instill in us virtues like goodness, empathy, kindness, moral accountability, generosity, moral obligation, self-sacrifice, and faithfulness. These are virtues we might never attain in a world free of suffering. When we consider this, it's logical to believe that of all possible worlds, only a world with suffering could maximize God's ultimate purpose for His creation. And only in such a world could the maximal number of people come to freely know Him. This not only gives a new meaning to our earthly suffering, but it gives us the hope of knowing that in the midst of our momentary pain, there is a far greater plan at work. A plan that leads to ultimate happiness. 1 Corinthians says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known."